So we kind of talked about the way that the revolution is starting, kind of the perception, the movement away from oppressing the majority, the 97%. We're going to start talking about how the reforms and terror are going to take over the revolution. It's no longer just violent uprisings to get what you want or to get bread or to kick certain people out of power or to disrupt the system of debt and debt repayment that's gone on for so long. Now we're going to move on and show how the revolution is going to change from what I would say is productive into basically just fear mongering and terror. So where people are trying to out revolutionary each other, which is a concept that we'll talk about. All right. First thing we need to cover is the idea of fraternity. That is the state or feeling of friendship and mutual support within a group. Kind of a aspect here when we talk about their ideas of natural rights, going back to John Locke. So the National Assembly is going to eliminate the estate system, the old regime. That means there is no first, second, third estate. Everybody is just a person. There's no longer a class system in a way. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't nobility and poor people. What that means is that there's no formal recognized way of differentiating them by law. So there is no first estate voting. If you're voting and you're noble, it's the same as if you're voting and you're a peasant. They're going to adopt the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, essentially their kind of earliest constitution in a way. This is where they're going to put forth the Enlightenment ideas that they had been learning about, the same ones that influenced the American Revolution. Now, for them, it's not going to be life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's liberty, equality, and fraternity, or the idea of kind of this mutual support and brotherhood in a way, right? The idea that you have the right to liberty, you have the right to some equality, and you have the right to feel like you're part of a group in a way, feel like you're part of the body of people. Now, when we talk about the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, there are a couple of articles that we should point out and see how close they are. If you look at the bottom, where have we seen these ideas? Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. The idea of equality, egalitarianism, the idea that everybody is the same. It's a Wollstonecraft idea, which were specific as rights of liberty, private property, and the inviolability of the person and the resistance to oppression. Again, the idea that if a government is to oppress you, you have the right to get rid of it. Right? All citizens are equal before the law and have the right to participate in legislation directly or indirectly. They have the right to vote themselves or to have a representative vote for them. This is the early idea of a republic and the idea of equality before the law. Everybody has the right to a fair trial. Another concept that's ingrained in the Constitution. No one is to be arrested without judicial order. You have to have some kind of judicial review. Somebody has to watch over you. A judge has to watch over your trial. Freedom of religion and freedom of speech as safeguards to public law and order. Essentially saying that you can say whatever you want as long as it is productive to the order and law of the world, right, or of your country. All of these were taken either from the Enlightenment ideas or lifted from the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, all of those things. So we can see that these are directly influencing one another. Now, as far as the reforms go, we're moving away from the estates. So naturally, the church is going to lose its land and political independence. The church, one of the Enlightenment ideas was that separation of church and state. So how is it that you could give the church its own voting power or give it land that's owned by the government? That just didn't make sense. So essentially, all of that was stripped away. The church was no longer seen as this political entity. Now, as this is happening, and again, you're seeing this for the second time now, the royal family is going to try to escape because now the reformations, the revolution is getting a little bit extreme and they're starting to target people at the top. Well, who's at the tippy top? That would be the king. So he's going to try to escape. He does not want to be caught when he's the next person in the line of sights, but he gets caught right on the border. Now, as far as public perception goes, how do you see it as a French citizen when your king, when your president, whatever it is, when he's trying to escape your country because he can't control you anymore? That looks really bad. Not only is he giving up on you, but essentially it almost seems like he's going to go somewhere else to try to invade you. And that was kind of the public perception, is that he's going to get an army from one of his buddies and they're going to roll in and just kill off the revolutionaries to put him back in power. Well, now you're not just a bad guy, you're a really bad guy to the revolutionaries who now have all of the power. Now, the National Assembly is going to create this new constitution. Now, again, the weird thing here is that they're not calling for a complete destruction of the system. They're looking for representation. So they're looking for a limited constitutional monarchy. They want to keep the king in charge in some way. But what they want to do is they want to create a legislative body, something like a Congress, somebody to make laws. They're not saying kill the king, get rid of, start a republic. That wasn't the call. The call for most of the people was to limit his power and give some of the power back to the people. Now, the big problem that's still plaguing them is the food shortages and the debt, because revolutions are expensive. And if nobody is getting taxed and all of this political change is happening, there's a lot of things that are falling through the cracks, namely covering the debt. Because you still have a massive amount of debt from the war, a massive amount of debt from people not being taxed, and food shortages that are very regular here. Now, 3 groups are going to appear in the legislative body, the legislative assembly. That's going to be the radicals, the moderates, and the conservatives. And these are going to be the big players moving forward. This point, when the legislative assembly occurs, or when it's created, this is where the revolution goes from being, I would argue, very moderate and very kind of justified, to people trying to outdo one another on how radical they can be. So we have here is the breakup of the legislative assembly. These are going to be the lawmakers. These are the 3 major groups that make up this group. You have the radicals, the moderates, and the conservatives. So if we simplified this, the radicals are going to want big changes now. They're looking for the biggest change in the government. You have the moderates that want some changes and the conservatives that want no changes. Makes perfect sense. Now, what is it that they are actually vying for? What is it that they are pushing for? Well, the radicals want a republic, which is all well and good. When we see that, when we see a republic, we think, well, that must be the right group. That must be the one that have the best cause or are most justified, because they're trying to give as much representation to their people as possible and get rid of a king. The problem is that the radicals were also the ones that had this mentality of any means necessary, right? Kind of that Machiavellian idea. They were willing to kill people off. They were willing to have violent uprisings against their own people for those that didn't fully support their ideas. So they were what we would call the vocal minority. They were a small group that was very, very aggressive with their tactics. Well, that's all well and good, but if you're threatening to kill people if they don't support you, it's really hard to get others to support you, essentially. If you're not radical enough, you can't be a part of them. So that means that they're often killing off their own people. You have the moderates, which is the largest group in the legislative body. They're looking for a constitutional monarchy. They want to keep the king in charge, but they want to bring some of that power back to the people and give them representation. This legislative body is supposed to be the voice of the people. So the king stays in charge, he gets some of his powers taken away from him, and there's a check on his power, but the voice of the people stays in the legislative body. And then the conservatives are going to want to return to absolute monarchy, essentially favoring the idea of a one king ruler or a one person ruler. Essentially, they think that the people shouldn't have a voice. Again, this is another very small group, but these are people that were basically afraid of change. They didn't want this chaos. They didn't want the revolution. They didn't want people to have this voice because they thought that the wrong people would be in charge, especially when they're looking at the radicals, when they're looking at people that are fighting for violent overthrow. That's what they were afraid of. So the conservatives and radicals are very opposed to each other, and the moderates are basically there trying to fight for the system that they've already established.